I was standing at my kitchen island on a perfectly reasonable Tuesday morning in Bellevue, Washington, sipping a lukewarm mug of black coffee and actively ignoring my laptop. I'm a digital project manager, and I was in the middle of trying to formulate a massive catch-up plan on ClickUp for a client of mine, Olaf, who somehow had a backlog of 16 outstanding long-form videos that needed reviewing on Flask. My wife had already left for her office downtown, leaving me to the sacred silence of a work-from-home morning. And then, it happened. The piece was violently murdered by the mechanical shriek of a chainsaw. Now, I don't mean a polite, battery-operated little trimmer. I mean a sputtering, gas-guzzling, two-stroke monster that sounded like it was chewing through bone right outside my dining room window. I practically dropped my coffee, sprinting toward the back deck in nothing but my plaid boxers and a faded gray t-shirt. What I saw when I threw open the sliding glass door actually made my brain short-circuit for a solid 5 seconds. My property is one of those older Bellevue fixer-uppers, and its absolute best feature, the only reason my wife and I bought the place, was the property line. Specifically, the massive, century-old, 15-foot-tall Western Red Cedar hedge that separated my backyard from the neighboring lot. It was a living, breathing fortress of thick, green foliage. It blocked out the wind, it blocked out the noise, and most importantly, it blocked out Brenda. Brenda is my neighbor. Her entire personality can be summed up by her pristine, blindingly white Lexus SUV and the fact that she has the HOA bylaws memorized, despite our specific street not actually being in the HOA. She is a woman who treats customer service workers like personal indentured servants and views anyone else's property as a mere extension of her own aesthetic domain. And right there, standing on her immaculate turf, was Brenda. She was wearing a beige tennis skirt, holding a bedazzled travel mug, and actively pointing a manicured finger at a guy in a high-vis vest who was actively butchering my historical trees. He had already carved a jagged, 6-foot-wide hole straight through the middle of the canopy. A catastrophic wound of splintered wood and shredded green needles. "Hey!" I screamed, my voice cracking like a teenager as I vaulted over my deck railing and landed barefoot in the damp Pacific Northwest grass. "Hey! Shut that thing off! Shut it off right now!" The guy with the chainsaw froze, looking between me, a wild-eyed, half-naked man charging across the lawn. And Brenda. He wisely killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, save for the soft thud of a massive cedar branch hitting the earth. "Excuse me," Brenda said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for explaining basic math to a toddler. "We're in the middle of a landscaping project. Put some clothes on, for heaven's sake." "Brenda, what are you doing?" I demanded, pointing a shaking finger at the massacred stump. "That is my hedge. You're cutting down my hedge." Brenda sighed, taking a delicate sip from her travel mug. "It is an eyesore. It's completely overgrown, it's dropping acidic needles into my flower beds, and it is blocking my morning sun. I told you 3 months ago I was going to have it trimmed back." "Trimmed back?" I yelled, gesturing wildly at the 4-foot gap where my privacy used to be. "You didn't trim it, Brenda, you amputated it. And it's not yours to cut, it is on my property." "It is on the property line," she countered smoothly, waving her hand dismissively. "Which makes it a shared nuisance. And since you clearly don't have the funds to maintain your yard properly, I took the initiative. You should be thanking me. Now, please go inside. Go on. You're distracting my contractor." I turned my attention to the guy in the vest. He looked like he was regretting every life choice that had led him to this backyard. "Who are you?" I asked him, trying to lower my voice to a dangerous, steady calm. "Are you bonded? Insured? Do you have a business card?" I'm just a guy she hired off next door," he mumbled, taking a step back. "She said it was her hedge, man. I'm just getting paid hourly." "Well, you need to pack up your tools and get off my property line right now," I told him. Because if you touch another branch, I'm having you arrested for trespassing and vandalism." "Oh, don't be so dramatic," Brenda scoffed, rolling her eyes so hard I thought she might detach her retinas. "You aren't having anyone arrested. Finish the job, Gary." Gary looked at the chainsaw, looked at Brenda, and then looked at me. "Yeah, I'm gonna go take my lunch break," he muttered, grabbing his gear and speed-walking toward the driveway. "Gary, get back here!" Brenda shrieked, her composed facade finally slipping. She turned her glare onto me. "You are completely unhinged. I am calling the police." "Please do," I yelled back, the adrenaline making my hands shake. "Because I'm dialing them right now." I marched back into my house, grabbed my phone off the kitchen counter, and dialed the non-emergency line for the Bellevue Police Department. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I practically vibrated with rage as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. While I waited, I quickly threw on a pair of jeans and a hoodie, not wanting to negotiate with law enforcement while wearing novelty boxers. 10 minutes later, a white SUV cruiser pulled up to the curb. 2 officers stepped out, looking incredibly bored. They strolled up my driveway, thumbs hooked in their tactical vests, projecting the universal aura of cops who really didn't want to be dealing with a suburban turf war. I met them in the front yard, taking a deep breath to ensure I didn't come across as the hysterical neighbor Brenda was undoubtedly going to paint me as. "Officers, thank you for coming," I started, keeping my tone perfectly measured and professional. "My neighbor just directed a hired laborer to cut down a 25-foot section of a century-old cedar hedge that sits on my property." Before they could even respond, Brenda came clicking down her driveway in her expensive tennis shoes. "Officers," she gasped, pressing a hand to her chest like she was a Victorian maiden in distress. "Thank goodness you're here. This man came charging out of his house, half naked, screaming obscenities at me and threatening my landscaper. I feel completely unsafe in my own home." The older of the 2 cops, a guy with salt and pepper hair and a nameplate that read, Miller, let out a heavy, visible sigh. He looked at me. "Is this true, sir? Were you threatening her landscaper?" "I told him to stop destroying my property or I would call you guys to have him trespassed," I clarified. "I was asleep. I woke up to a chainsaw tearing through my trees. I ran outside to stop it." "They are not his trees," Brenda interrupted, her voice shrill. "They are on the property line. They are a shared boundary, and they were completely out of control. I have every right to prune them." Officer Miller held up a hand, silencing us both. "Okay, let's go take a look." We walked in a tense, awkward procession to the backyard. I pointed to the gaping, ragged hole in the wall of greenery. The raw, white wood of the severed trunks gleamed in the morning light like exposed bone. It looked absolutely pathetic. You could see straight through into Brenda's immaculate, sterile patio. My privacy was entirely gone. Officer Miller stared at the stumps. He took off his hat and scratched his head. Then he turned to me. "Look, man," Miller said, his voice flat. "I get why you're upset. That's a hell of a mess. But we can't arrest her for landscaping. We don't carry surveying equipment in the squad cars. We don't know where the exact property line is, and frankly, neither do you without a plat map." "I have the county tax records," I argued, my frustration mounting. "The hedge is entirely on my side of the line." "That may be," the second cop chimed in, "but it's a property line dispute. It's a civil matter." A civil matter. The words echoed in my ears. To the average person, being told something is a civil matter by the police feels like a complete dismissal. It feels like defeat. It means the cops aren't going to put anyone in handcuffs, they aren't going to write a ticket, and they are washing their hands of the situation. But to me, to the guy who literally built a brand around legal revenge and navigating bureaucratic nightmares, a civil matter are the 2 most magical, dangerous, and expensive words in the English language, provided you know exactly how to use them. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. The anger evaporated, replaced by a deep, dark, and highly calculated thrill. I didn't want Brenda in handcuffs. Handcuffs are temporary. Jail is temporary. A civil lawsuit? Financial devastation? That lasts forever. You know what, officers? I said, my voice dropping an octave, completely devoid of the panic from 10 minutes ago. You're absolutely right. This isn't a criminal issue. I apologize for taking up your time. Brenda looked at me, a smug, triumphant smile spreading across her face. She practically preened. See, I told you, she said to the cops. He's completely overreacting. Thank you for handling this, officers. Officer Miller gave me a long, hard look, perhaps sensing the sudden shift in my demeanor. But he just nodded. Have a good day, folks. Try to keep it neighborly. They walked back to their cruiser. Brenda turned to me, her arms crossed, the absolute picture of arrogant victory. Next time, maybe you'll keep your yard maintained, and the adults won't have to step in and do it for you, she sneered, before turning on her heel and marching back toward her white Lexus. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, staring at the shattered remains of my beautiful cedar trees, a slow smile creeping onto my face. I walked back inside, went straight to my home office, and opened up my laptop. I didn't open ClickUp. I didn't message Olaf. I opened Google. First things first, I needed to understand exactly what I had lost. I wasn't going to call some random lawn care company for an estimate to plant a few sad little bushes. I needed the big guns. I needed a professional who could articulate the sheer, unadulterated value of a century-old biological asset. I searched for ISA Board Certified Master Arborist Bellevue. It took a few phone calls, explaining the situation and dropping the phrase pending civil litigation to get past a few receptionists, but I finally got through to a guy named Dave. Dave arrived at my house 2 days later. He drove a battered green Tacoma covered in bumper stickers about saving the old-growth forests. He hopped out wearing hiking boots, a flannel shirt, and a look of permanent, intense focus. Dave wasn't a landscaper. Dave was a tree nerd. He looked at trees the way an art appraiser looks at a lost Michelangelo. I led him to the backyard. Dave stopped in his tracks when he saw the gap. He slowly took off his sunglasses. "Oh, the humanity," Dave whispered. He wasn't being sarcastic. He genuinely looked heartbroken. He walked up to the mangled stumps, running his calloused fingers over the jagged cuts left by Gary's two-stroke chainsaw. He pulled a specialized measuring tape out of his pocket, then a notepad, then a small digital caliper. "This is a Western Red Cedar. Thuja plicata," Dave muttered, almost talking to himself as he documented the carnage. "Beautiful specimens. At least 80 to 100 years old based on the growth rings on these cuts. Healthy, too. No signs of heart rot, no insect damage. They were in the prime of their life." "My neighbor thinks they were an eyesore," I said, leaning against my deck railing, watching him work. Dave scoffed, a sound of pure disgust. "Your neighbor is an idiot. Do you have any idea what these trees were doing for your property? They were stabilizing the soil, managing stormwater runoff, providing a micro-ecosystem for local avians, and offering massive thermal insulation for your house, not to mention the pure aesthetic privacy." "Can they be saved?" I asked. "No," Dave said bluntly. "Conifers like this don't coppice well. They won't grow back from the stumps. You have to remove the root wads and start completely over. It's a total loss for this 25-foot section." "So what's the damage?" I asked, pulling out a notepad of my own. "If I sued her for the replacement cost, what are we talking? 5 grand? 10? Dave stopped writing and looked at me, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. It was the smile of a man who rarely got to unleash the full, devastating power of his hyper-specific knowledge. "My friend," Dave said, walking over to me, "we don't use Home Depot prices in a court of law. You can't go buy a 100-year-old, 15-foot-tall, intertwined root system cedar hedge off a shelf. You cannot replace this. Therefore, We don't use standard replacement cost. What do we use? We use the trunk formula method, Dave explained, his eyes lighting up. It's the industry standard endorsed by the Council of Tree and Landscape Appraisers. We calculate the basic value based on the cross-sectional area of the trunks. Then we apply multipliers for the species rating, the condition rating, and the location rating. He gestured wildly at my yard. These are native, highly desirable species. They were in pristine condition, and their location, acting as a prime privacy screen in a high-value real estate market like Bellevue, pushes that multiplier through the roof. Dave spent another 2 hours in my yard. He measured every stump. He photographed the sawdust. He took soil samples. He was meticulous, clinical, and absolutely terrifying. 4 days later, Dave emailed me his official 40-page, beautifully bound Arborist report. It included high-resolution photographs, historical data on Western Red Cedars in King County, detailed mathematical breakdowns of the trunk formula method, and a comprehensive analysis of the loss of property value due to the destruction of the privacy screen. I skipped the botanical jargon and scrolled straight to the bottom line. I needed to see the number. There it was, highlighted in bold text on page 38. Total, appraised value and remediation cost, $31,666. I let out a low whistle, over $31,000 for a few trees. It was a massive number. It was enough to make anyone choke. It was enough to cause Brenda some serious, sweaty nights. But it wasn't enough for me. Because $31,000 is just restitution. That's just making me whole. That's not revenge. That's not malicious compliance. That doesn't teach a lesson to a person who believes the rules of the universe bend to their personal convenience. I opened a new tab on my browser. I went straight to the official website of the Washington State Legislature. I typed a very specific code into the search bar, a legal loophole I had stumbled across years ago during a deep dive into municipal property codes for a completely different project. RCW 64.12030. The page loaded. I read the text out loud to the empty room, savoring every single syllable like a fine wine. Whenever any person shall cut down, girdle, or otherwise injure, or carry off any tree, including a Christmas tree, timber, or shrub on the land of another person, without lawful authority, in an action by the person, city, or town, against the person committing the trespasses, or any of them, any judgment for the plaintiff shall be for treble the amount of damages claimed or assessed. Treble damages. It means exactly what it sounds like. If someone willfully and intentionally trespasses on your property and destroys your trees without your permission, Washington State doesn't just make them pay you back, they punish them. They triple the damages. It's a punitive law dating back to the logging days, designed to stop timber companies from stealing from each other. But it applies to residential hedges in Bellevue just as effectively. I pulled up the calculator on my phone. My hands were actually shaking with anticipation. $31,666 multiplied by 3. The number flashed on the screen, $94,998. Let's just round that up to an even $95,000 for the emotional distress of having to look at Brenda's smug face, shall we? I sat back in my desk chair, staring at the ceiling. The trap was officially built. It was a perfect, unassailable, legally mandated bear trap, and Brenda had already willingly clamped it around her own ankle. She just didn't know it yet. My wife and I file our taxes separately, which means this absolute windfall was going to drop straight into my personal portfolio, a sweet little cherry on top of this vindictive sundae. It was time to hire a lawyer and draft a demand letter that would hit Brenda's pristine white house like a tactical nuke. Finding a lawyer who truly appreciates the art of petty, bureaucratic warfare is honestly like trying to find a needle in a haystack of boring corporate suits. I mean, I didn't just need someone to file paperwork. I needed a legal artist. I needed a shark who understood the absolute poetry of malicious compliance. After doing some digging, I found a guy named Saul. Saul wasn't one of those billboard lawyers with the slicked-back hair who promises you millions after a car crash. Saul operated out of a remarkably unassuming office park near downtown Bellevue, the kind of place sandwiched between a questionable chiropractor and a defunct travel agency. But Saul had a reputation. He was a real estate litigator who, rumor had it, once made a developer cry during a zoning board hearing over a 3-inch easement discrepancy. Literally, my kind of guy. I walked into his office on a Thursday morning, hauling Dave's beautiful 40-page custom-bound Arborist report under my arm, like it was the nuclear launch codes. Saul was sitting behind a desk piled high with manila folders, wearing a rumpled button-down shirt and looking like he hadn't slept since 2019. "So," Saul said, not looking up from a document he was annotating with a red pen. "You're the guy with the massacred cedars." "That's me, I guess," I said, dropping the Arborist report onto the only clear spot on his desk. It made a highly satisfying, heavy thud. Saul finally looked up, eyeing the thick document. He picked it up, adjusted his glasses, and started flipping through the pages. I just sat there, honestly vibrating with anticipation as I watched his eyes scan the botanical jargon, the soil analysis, and the trunk formula method calculations. "Your arborist is thorough," Saul muttered, a hint of genuine respect creeping into his gravelly voice. "Dave, right?" "Yeah, I've worked with Dave before. He treats trees better than most people treat their kids. Okay, let's see the bottom line." He flipped to page 38. He stared at the bolded $31,666 figure. He didn't blink. He didn't gasp. He just slowly tapped his pen against the desk. $31 grand, Saul said flatly. "For 25 feet of hedge. Your neighbor must be losing her absolute mind right now." "Oh, she doesn't know yet," I said, a massive, uncontainable grin spreading across my face. "And I mean, that's just the baseline, right? I was doing some reading online, like casual reading. Have you ever heard of a little piece of legislation called RCW 64.12.030? Saul stopped tapping the pen. He looked at me, and for the first time, a slow, predatory smile mirrored my own. It was the look of two predators recognizing each other at the watering hole. "Timber trespass," Saul whispered, almost reverently. "Treble damages. You want to hit her with the triple." "I literally want to hit her with the legal equivalent of a meteor," I corrected him. She stood on her pristine lawn, sipping from a bedazzled mug, and watched a hired hack butcher a 100-year-old ecosystem on my property because it blocked her morning sunlight. She told the cops I was crazy. She treated me like a peasant trespassing on her kingdom. So yeah, Saul, I want all $95,000 of it. Every single penny. "I like you," Saul chuckled, tossing the report down and leaning back in his chair. "All right, let's draft the nuke." We spent the next 3 hours locked in his office, crafting what I can only describe as a masterpiece of modern aggressive literature. I mean, we didn't just write a demand letter. We wrote a psychological thriller where Brenda was the tragic victim of her own blinding hubris. Saul was a master at the legal phrasing. He used words like willful, malicious, unauthorized destruction, and irreparable ecological harm. We detailed the exact timeline of events. We included a transcript of her admitting to hiring the contractor on the day of the incident. We attached the entire Arborist report as Exhibit A. And then we dropped the hammer. Pursuant to Washington State RCW 64.12030, our client is legally entitled to treble damages for the willful and unauthorized destruction of timber on his property. Therefore, We are demanding a total remediation and penalty payment of $94,998, payable via certified cashier's check within 30 days of the receipt of this notice. Failure to comply will result in immediate civil litigation, wherein we will also seek compensation for all associated legal fees, court costs, and surveyor expenses. It was beautiful. I literally wanted to frame it. Now, Saul said, printing the document on heavy, expensive-feeling watermarked legal paper. We don't just mail this. We don't just send it certified. When you're dropping a $95,000 anvil on someone's head, you use a process server. You want to see the look on her face when she gets served? Honestly, I would pay extra for a drone live stream of the event, I admitted. I'll have my best guy handle it, Saul promised. Go home. Keep your cameras rolling. And whatever you do, when she inevitably loses her mind and comes screaming over the property line, do not engage. Record everything. Say nothing. Let her dig the hole. I left Saul's office, feeling like I was floating on a cloud of pure, vindictive joy. I went home, logged onto Slack to knock out a few quick client messages. I had to finalize a timeline for Steve, one of my main corporate accounts. And then I basically set up a sniper's nest by my dining room window. It took 2 days for the process server to arrive. It was a Saturday morning. The sun was shining. The birds were singing, or at least the ones whose habitat Brenda hadn't violently logged were singing. I was drinking my coffee, perfectly concealed behind my blinds, when a nondescript black sedan pulled up to Brenda's curb. A guy in a neat polo shirt and khakis got out. He carried a thick manila envelope. He walked up Brenda's immaculate paver driveway, sidestepping her precious white Lexus SUV, and rang the Ring doorbell. I held my breath. I honestly felt like I was watching the season finale of a prestige HBO drama. After about 30 seconds, the massive oak front door swung open. There was Brenda. She was wearing her weekend uniform. Lululemon leggings, a cashmere sweater, and a look of vague annoyance at having her morning interrupted. The process server said something. Brenda frowned, looking confused. She reached out and took the envelope. The process server nodded, turned on his heel, and walked briskly back to his car. Brenda stood on her porch, staring at the envelope. She ripped it open right there. She pulled out the thick stack of watermarked paper and Dave's heavy Arborist report. I literally pressed my forehead against the glass of my window to get a better view. I watched her eyes scan the first page. I saw the exact moment her brain processed the number at the bottom of the letter. Her mouth physically dropped open, like an actual cartoonish jaw drop. Her hand flew to her chest. She stumbled backward a half step, dropping the envelope. The Arborist report hit her porch with a heavy smack, scattering a few loose pages onto her perfect welcome mat. She stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, her face draining of all color. Then, the shock wore off, and the sheer, unadulterated hubris kicked in. She didn't look scared. She looked furious. Her face flushed a deep, blotchy red. She practically threw the demand letter on the ground, stomped down her driveway, and marched directly toward my property line. I stepped away from the window, my heart hammering a triumphant drumbeat against my ribs. I grabbed my phone, hit record on the camera app, and walked out my back door to meet her. "You!" Brenda shrieked the second I stepped onto the deck. She was standing at the edge of the butchered hedge, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at me. "You are completely insane! You are a lunatic!" "Good morning, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and even, making sure the camera captured her unhinged state. "Did you receive the correspondence from my attorney?" $95,000? She screamed, her voice echoing through the quiet suburban neighborhood. "Are you out of your mind? I am not paying you a single dime. Those were my trees. They were on my property." "The arborist report and the county tax records state otherwise, Brenda," I replied, honestly enjoying the way the veins in her neck were popping out. "You destroyed a century-old biological asset on my side of the boundary line. The law is very clear on this." "The law?" She let out a laugh that sounded like a seagull choking on a French fry. "You think you can extort me with some bogus lawyer letter? I know exactly where my property line is. The original builder told my husband exactly where it was 20 years ago. You are trying to scam me, and I am not going to let you get away with it." "Okay, Brenda," I said, shrugging nonchalantly. "If you refuse to pay the demand, we will proceed to civil court. My lawyer will be in touch. Have a great weekend." "Oh, you'll be hearing from my lawyer," she yelled as I turned my back and walked inside. "And I'm getting a surveyor. I'm going to prove those ugly weeds were on my land, and then I'm going to sue you for harassment." I shut the sliding glass door and locked it. I leaned against the glass, laughing so hard my sides actually hurt. She was doubling down. It was the classic mistake of the chronically entitled. Instead of apologizing, instead of negotiating, she was going to spend her own money trying to prove a lie. I sent the video clip to Saul on Slack. His response came back 3 minutes later. "Perfect. Let her hire a surveyor. She's about to pay someone to legally prove she's guilty. Keep the cameras rolling." The next few days were quiet, suspiciously quiet. I knew Brenda was scrambling. I imagined her frantically calling insurance agents, screaming at paralegals, and desperately trying to find a professional who would tell her what she wanted to hear. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the demand letter dropped, I found Steve. I had just wrapped up a Zoom call with my team, going over some operational tracking setups, and decided to stretch my legs. I walked out to the kitchen to grab a LaCroix, glanced out the window, and stopped dead in my tracks. There was a man in my backyard. He wasn't on the property line. He wasn't on Brenda's side. He was a solid 6 feet deep into my personal, private sanctuary. He was wearing muddy work boots, a faded neon yellow vest over a flannel shirt, and a battered Seattle Mariners baseball cap. He was holding a metal detector and stabbing little brightly colored pink flags into my pristine lawn. I felt that familiar, hot spark of territorial rage flare up in my chest. But then, the sovereign ruling instincts kicked in. This wasn't just some random trespasser. This was Brenda's desperate Hail Mary. I grabbed my phone, hit record, and strolled out the back door. I didn't yell, I didn't run. I just walked casually across the grass until I was standing about 10 feet away from the guy. "Hey there," I called out, my tone cheerful but aggressively loud. The guy jumped, nearly dropping his metal detector. He spun around, looking guilty. "Oh, hey. Sorry, didn't see you there." "I gathered that," I said, keeping the camera pointed steadily at his face. "Can I ask what you're doing actively planting flags in the middle of my backyard?" "I'm a surveyor," the guy said, puffing out his chest a little, trying to reclaim some authority. "Name's Steve. I was hired by the property owner next door. She said she needs the boundary lines officially marked out due to a dispute." I looked at Steve. I looked at his gear. Honestly, I've worked with professional surveying crews on commercial shoots before. They show up with thousands of dollars of optical equipment, robotic total stations, and GPS rovers. Steve had a metal detector that looked like it belonged to a retired guy looking for loose change on Alki Beach, and a measuring tape tucked into his belt. "You were hired by Brenda," I clarified, making sure the audio caught every word. "Yeah, Brenda," Steve confirmed, nodding toward the White House. "She said the line runs right through here. I'm just trying to find the old iron pins." "Steve, I have a very important question for you," I said, taking a step closer. "Did Brenda give you permission to stand on my property to look for these pins?" Steve frowned, scratching his beard under his mariner's cap. "Well, she said the line was right here, so I guess—" "Let me stop you right there, Steve," I interrupted, my voice hardening into that authoritative project manager tone I usually reserved for contractors who miss their deadlines. "Brenda does not own this land. You are currently standing at least 6 feet inside my legal property line. You did not request permission to enter my property. I did not grant you an easement, which means, legally speaking, you are trespassing." Steve looked down at his boots, then back at me. He suddenly looked very uncomfortable. "Look, man, I'm just doing a job. I charge by the hour. I just need to find the pins." "I understand that, Steve," I said, maintaining the unyielding, polite facade of malicious compliance. "And I respect a man trying to make a living, but you cannot do your job on my land without my consent. Furthermore, I am currently involved in active, high-stakes civil litigation with the neighbor who hired you. If you alter, damage, or misrepresent any physical evidence on my property, you become a party to that lawsuit." I watched the exact moment Steve decided he was not getting paid enough for this. The color drained from his face faster than it had from Brenda's. Whoa, lawsuit?" Steve stammered, holding his hands up in surrender. "Hey man, I don't want any trouble. I'm just a freelance guy. I found the gig on Craigslist." Craigslist? I literally had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing out loud. Brenda, facing a $95,000 legal threat, had gone on Craigslist to hire the cheapest surveyor she could find to magically redraw her property lines. It was almost sad how stupid she was. "I appreciate your honesty, Steve," I said. "So here is what is going to happen. You are going to pull those pink flags out of my grass. You are going to pack up your metal detector, and you are going to walk back over to Brenda's side of the invisible line and never cross it again. If you do, I will call the Bellevue police, and I will have you formally charged with criminal trespassing. Do we have an understanding?" Steve didn't hesitate. He practically dove into the grass, violently yanking his little pink flags out of the dirt like they were radioactive. "Yes, sir. Absolutely. My bad, man. I was just following what the lady told me." "I know, Steve," I said softly, panning the camera to catch him fleeing back toward the butchered hedge. "Have a great day." I watched him scramble over the property line, clutching his metal detector like a shield. I stopped recording, feeling an incredible rush of adrenaline. I had defended the castle. I had thwarted the Craigslist surveyor. But Brenda wasn't done. Oh no. Brenda was a creature of pure, unadulterated entitlement, and she had just watched her hired gun get chased off the battlefield. 10 minutes later, I was back in my kitchen, uploading the footage to Saul's secure Google Drive folder when I heard the heavy, aggressive slamming of car doors out front. I walked to the front window. It was the white SUV cruiser. The Bellevue police were back. And standing in the driveway, frantically gesturing toward my house with a look of manic vindication on her face, was Brenda. I sighed, shaking my head. I honestly couldn't believe she had called them. It was like she was physically allergic to making smart decisions. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch before the officers even made it halfway up the walk. It was the same 2 cops from last week. Officer Miller, the older guy with the salt and pepper hair, looked like he would rather be anywhere else on planet Earth. The younger cop just looked exhausted. "Afternoon, officers," I called out, leaning casually against the porch pillar. "Welcome back." Officer Miller let out a deep, weary sigh. "Sir, we got a call from your neighbor. She's claiming you are harassing her hired contractors and aggressively interfering with a legal land survey." "He came charging out of his house like a maniac," Brenda yelled from her driveway, safely behind the younger officer. "He threatened the poor man. I hired a licensed professional to survey my land, and this lunatic intimidated him off the property. I want him arrested for harassment." Miller looked at me, raising an eyebrow. "Is that true? Did you threaten a surveyor?" "Officer Miller," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the yard so Brenda wouldn't miss a single syllable. "What I did was step out my back door, holding my cell phone, and politely inform a man named Steve, whom Brenda apparently found on Craigslist, that he was standing 6 feet inside my private property without my permission." "He's lying!" Brenda shrieked. "It's my property! He's trying to steal my land!" I have the entire interaction recorded on video, with crystal clear audio, I continued, ignoring her completely and keeping my eyes locked on Miller. "At no point did I raise my voice. At no point did I make a physical threat. I simply informed him of the trespassing laws in Washington state and asked him to leave my land, which he voluntarily did, apologizing as he went. Miller rubbed the bridge of his nose. He turned slowly to look at Brenda. "Ma'am," Miller said, his voice dripping with tired authority. "Did this surveyor cross onto his side of the yard?" "Well, he was trying to find the boundary pins," Brenda argued, her voice taking on a whiny, defensive edge. "He has to walk around to find them." "Not without permission, he doesn't," the younger cop interjected, crossing his arms. "If he doesn't have an easement or the homeowner's consent, he can't go onto that property. That's trespassing." "But it's my property," she insisted, stamping her foot like a petulant child. "The hedge was on my property. My original builder told my husband—" "Ma'am," Miller cut her off, his voice suddenly sharp enough to slice glass. "Stop. We were out here last week. We told you then, this is a civil matter. It is a property line dispute." "Exactly," Brenda cried triumphantly. "It's a dispute, so my surveyor has a right to investigate." "No, he does not," Miller said, taking a step toward her, his posture straightening into full cop mode. "Unless you have a court order from a judge granting you access to his land, you and anyone you hire must stay off his property. Period." Brenda's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked completely, utterly dumbfounded. The reality of the situation was finally, painfully, crashing through her wall of ignorance. "Now," Miller continued, turning back to me. "Sir, you said you have this interaction on video?" "Yes, officer. Happy to show it to you if you'd like to verify." "That won't be necessary right now," Miller said. He looked back at Brenda. The patience was entirely gone from his eyes. "Ma'am, if you call us out here again because someone asked your hired help to leave their property, we are going to have a very different conversation about the misuse of emergency services. Do you understand me?" Brenda blinked. Her face flushed that deep, blotchy red again. She looked at the cops, she looked at me, and then she looked down at her immaculate tennis shoes. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, her voice trembling with impotent rage. "You are all against me." She turned on her heel and practically ran back into her house, slamming the massive oak door so hard I heard the glass rattle. Officer Miller shook his head, turning back to me. "I apologize for the interruption, sir. Seems like you're handling this just fine." "Just letting the legal process play out, officer," I smiled. "Have a quiet shift." They got back in their cruiser and drove away. I stood on my porch for a long moment, breathing in the sweet, crisp Bellevue air. Brenda had tried the police. She had tried the cheap surveyor. She had tried intimidation. And every single time, she had slammed face first into the brick wall of malicious, documented compliance. The trap hadn't just snapped shut. It had locked her in an iron cage. Now it was just a matter of waiting for her to stop thrashing and finally hand over the check. Honestly, I couldn't wait for the deposition. That was going to be the main event. The next 3 weeks were, honestly, an exercise in sheer, agonizing patience. When you drop a nuclear legal threat on someone like Brenda, you kind of expect immediate fireworks. You expect screaming across the lawn, or maybe a hastily written apology note taped to your door, or at least some kind of visible meltdown. But instead, it was just crickets. I mean, I went back to my normal life. I spent my days in my home office, drinking way too much coffee and staring at my dual monitors. I was deep in the weeds of restructuring a massive, overly complicated Notion database for one of my freelance production teams, trying to get all their video assets tagged properly, when my phone finally buzzed on my desk. It was Saul. I literally snatched the phone up before the second ring. "Tell me you have something good," I said, not even bothering with a hello. "Oh, I have something, all right." Saul's gravelly voice came through the speaker. He sounded like he was trying very hard not to laugh. "Are you sitting down? Because you're going to want to be sitting down for this." "I'm sitting," I said, minimizing my Notion window and leaning forward. Did she surrender? Did she send the check? Saul let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Not quite. Her attorney just sent over their official response to our demand letter. They rejected our claim for the $95,000, obviously, but they didn't just reject it. They made a counteroffer. A counteroffer? I echoed, feeling a sudden spike of adrenaline. Okay. What's the number? 10 grand? 20? $1,500, Saul said flatly. I just sat there in silence for a solid 5 seconds. My brain legitimately refused to process the words. Wait, like $1,500? Total? Total, Saul confirmed, the amusement practically dripping from his voice. And it gets better. The letter specifically states that this $1,500 is being offered as a gesture of goodwill to cover the cost of debris removal and yard cleanup. They are maintaining that the hedge was on the property line, that she had a legal right to prune it, and that any damage was unintentional and merely cosmetic. They also threw in a little paragraph threatening to countersue for harassment based on your interaction with her surveyor. I burst out laughing. I honestly couldn't help it. It was a loud, unhinged, hysterical laugh that echoed in my empty office. $1,500? For a 100-year-old 25-foot cedar privacy screen? That wouldn't even cover the cost of Dave the Arborist's report. I know, Saul said. It's insulting. It's a joke. Her lawyer is either a complete idiot, or Brenda lied to him about the extent of the damage, and he hasn't actually seen the photos. Or more likely, they're just hoping you're some easily intimidated suburbanite who will take a tiny check just to make the conflict go away. Well, they picked the wrong guy, I guess, I said, wiping a tear of mirth from my eye. So what's the next move? Do we reject it? We don't just reject it, Saul said, his voice dropping into that predatory, tactical register that made me so glad I hired him. We ignore the offer entirely. We escalate. Brenda is clinging to this delusion that the trees were a shared boundary. We need to shatter that delusion into 1,000,000 tiny pieces so she has absolutely zero defense when we file the actual lawsuit. It's time to bring in the heavy artillery. I'm listening, I said. You remember that Craigslist surveyor she tried to use? Saul asked. The guy you chased off? Steve, I chuckled. Yeah, I remember Steve. Right. Well, Steve was a hack looking for a quick buck, Saul explained. We are going to hire a forensic surveyor. I'm talking about a guy who gets called as an expert witness in multi-million-dollar commercial real estate disputes. A guy who doesn't just look at the dirt, he looks at the history of the dirt. It's going to cost you about $3 grand out of pocket, but it is the nail in the coffin. You cool with that? Honestly, Saul, at this point, I would sell a kidney to win this, I told him. Book the guy. The forensic surveyor's name was Harrison. He didn't drive a beat-up truck, and he definitely didn't find his clients on Craigslist. Harrison drove a spotless, custom-outfitted Mercedes Sprinter van packed with equipment that looked like it belonged on a NASA mission. He was a tall, incredibly thin man in his late 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the serious, unsmiling demeanor of a mortician. When he arrived at my house later that week, I walked out to meet him. I offered him a cup of coffee, which he politely declined, stating that caffeine interfered with his fine motor skills when calibrating his optical equipment. I literally loved this guy immediately. So, Mr. Harrison, I said, as we walked into the backyard, giving a wide berth to the gaping, ugly wound in my hedge. The neighbor claims the property line runs directly down the center of these stumps. I have the county plat maps that show it should be right at the edge of her grass. What's your process here? Harrison adjusted his glasses, looking at the stumps, then at Brenda's house, and then down at a thick roll of massive yellowed blueprints he had brought with him. County plat maps are merely a suggestion, sir, Harrison said, his voice a dry, monotone drawl. They are digitized interpretations of historical data, often subject to minor clerical errors over the decades. To determine the absolute legally binding boundary, we do not look at a computer screen. We look for the original monuments. Monuments? I asked. Like statues? Like iron pins, Harrison corrected. When this subdivision was originally platted and divided in 1924, the municipal surveyors drove heavy, solid iron rods deep into the earth at the exact corners of every lot. Over a century, those pins get buried under landscaping, soil erosion, and root systems. but they are still there. And they are the only truth the court recognizes. I watched in absolute fascination as Harrison went to work. He didn't just wander around with a metal detector. He set up a robotic total station, a massive yellow laser on a tripod, in the middle of my yard. He synced it to a GPS rover that looked like a high-tech walking stick. He spent an hour walking around the entire neighborhood, finding known benchmark points on the street corners and fire hydrants, triangulating the exact geographic coordinates of my lot. Then he came back to the DMZ, the ruined Hedge line. He consulted his 1924 blueprints. He measured, he calculated, and then he marked a spot on the ground. It wasn't on the property line, Brenda claimed. It wasn't even close. Harrison took a small, specialized spade from his belt. He knelt down in the dirt, right at the base of the largest severed cedar stump, and began to dig. He dug meticulously, like an archaeologist excavating a priceless artifact. He went down 6 inches, then a foot, then 18 inches. And then I heard it. A distinct, sharp clink. Metal on metal. Harrison didn't smile, but I saw a faint glimmer of satisfaction behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He reached into the hole with a gloved hand and cleared away the damp Pacific Northwest soil. "Sir," Harrison said, standing up and stepping back. "Would you care to take a look?" I practically sprinted over. I peered down into the narrow, deep hole. There, buried under decades of dirt and cedar needles, was a thick, rusted, perfectly intact iron rod. Is that the original pin?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "That is the original 1924 Southwest Corner monument," Harrison confirmed. He pulled out a neon orange flag and stabbed it into the earth directly above the hole. Then, he walked over to the other end of the ruined 25-foot section of hedge. He measured, he dug, and 20 minutes later, he found the second pin. He marked it with another orange flag. He took a spool of high-visibility pink string and tied it taut between the 2 flags, drawing a literal, physical line across the yard. I stood back and looked at it. I looked at the string. I looked at the massive, butchered stumps of my beautiful cedar trees. And then I started laughing again. It was just too perfect. It was beyond perfect. The pink string didn't run down the middle of the stumps. It didn't even run along the edge of the stumps. The string, the absolute, legally binding property line, was a full 4 feet away from the trees, entirely on Brenda's side of the grass. "Mr. Harrison," I said, pointing a shaking finger at the string, "please tell me what I'm looking at, legally speaking." "Legally speaking," Harrison said, packing his spade away. "The entire root system, trunk, and canopy of those trees existed entirely within the boundaries of your property. They were set back 4 feet from the property line. Your neighbor did not trim a shared boundary. She crossed 4 feet into your private property, committed a trespass, and felled your timber. It was a kill shot. It was the absolute, undeniable proof that Brenda had zero legal ground to stand on. I paid Harrison his $3,000 on the spot, and honestly, I would have tipped him another $1,000 if he'd let me. When Saul got Harrison's official, stamped surveyor's report, he didn't even call me. He just sent me an email with the PDF attached and a single sentence in the body of the text. "I'll schedule the deposition." This is the part of the legal system they don't really show you on TV. Everyone thinks it's all screaming in a courtroom and dramatic surprise witnesses. But real legal warfare is won in conference rooms under flickering fluorescent lights during depositions. A deposition is where you lock the enemy into a story under oath before the trial ever happens. If they lie, it's perjury. If they tell the truth, they hang themselves. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, about 2 months after the initial chainsaw incident. It took place in a massive, overly air-conditioned conference room at the office of Brenda's attorney, right in the heart of downtown Bellevue. I arrived early with Saul. I was wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit. I felt like I was walking into a championship boxing match. Saul, on the other hand, looked like he always did, rumpled, slightly annoyed, and terrifyingly sharp. He had a massive banker's box of documents that he practically slammed onto the polished mahogany table. 10 minutes later, the door opened. Brenda walked in. She was flanked by her lawyer, a slick-looking guy in his 30s who reeked of expensive cologne and misplaced confidence. Let's call him Chad. Chad had billable hours written all over his smug face. Brenda, however, did not look smug. She was wearing a beige twin set that looked entirely too formal, and she was clutching her designer handbag like it was a life preserver. She saw me sitting across the table, and her eyes immediately darted away. She looked pale. She looked nervous. Good, I thought. I mean, you should be. A court reporter was sitting at the head of the table, fingers hovering over a stenography machine. Chad cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. All right, let's get this over with, Chad said, projecting a fake air of boredom. We are here for the deposition of my client regarding the minor landscaping dispute. Saul didn't say a word. He just opened his banker's box and pulled out a stack of manila folders. The court reporter swore Brenda in. She raised her right hand, her voice trembling slightly as she swore to tell the truth. The whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Saul leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He looked at Brenda like a hawk looks at a particularly slow field mouse. Good morning, ma'am, Saul started, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Could you please state your full name and address for the record? Brenda stated her name and her address. Thank you, Saul said. Now let's establish a timeline. Do you recall the morning of Tuesday, the 14th of last month? Yes, I believe so, Brenda said, her eyes flicking to Chad. And on that morning, did you hire an individual to perform landscaping services on the western boundary of your property? I hired someone to clean up the overgrown brush, yes, she said defensively. I see, Saul nodded, pulling a document from his folder. And did you instruct this individual to use a chainsaw to cut down 25 linear feet of Western Red Cedar hedge? I told him to trim it, Brenda snapped, her voice rising. It was overgrown. It was dropping needles everywhere. I told him to cut it back to the property line so it would stop being a nuisance. The property line, Saul repeated, savoring the words. You stated earlier, in your attorney's response to our demand letter, that you believed the hedge was on the shared property line. Is that correct? Yes, Brenda said firmly, lifting her chin. My original builder told my husband 20 years ago that the line ran right through those bushes. I was well within my rights. Saul paused. He let the silence stretch out in the room. It was a classic lawyer tactic, letting the witness sit in the uncomfortable quiet of their own statement. Then he reached into his box and pulled out a sleek, black iPad. I'm going to introduce Exhibit A into the record, Saul said smoothly. He tapped the screen and slid the iPad across the table toward Brenda and Chad. This is a video recording taken by my client on the morning of the incident. Chad frowned, leaning in to look at the screen. Brenda stared at it like it was a venomous snake. Saul hit play. The audio filled the sterile conference room, the roaring of the chainsaw, my voice, panicked and shouting. Brenda, what are you doing? That is my hedge. You are cutting down my hedge. And then, clear as day, Brenda's voice echoed back. It is an eyesore. It is on the property line. Since you clearly don't have the funds to maintain your yard properly, I took the initiative. Finish the job, Gary. Saul paused the video right on Brenda's smug face as she ordered the contractor to keep cutting. Now, Saul said, his voice dropping another octave. In this video, my client explicitly informs you that the trees are on his property. He demands that you stop. And yet you instruct your hired contractor, Gary, to, quote, finish the job. Do you deny saying those words? He was screaming at me, Brenda protested, her face flushing that familiar, blotchy red. "I was terrified. I just wanted the job done so he would leave me alone." "You were terrified?" Saul asked, raising an eyebrow. "Is that why you told my client, 'You should be thanking me'?" Chad held up a hand. "Counsel, let's not badger the witness. My client's emotional state isn't the issue here. The issue is a boundary dispute. She believed she was acting on her own property." "Did she?" Saul asked, his eyes never leaving Brenda. He reached back into his box. He didn't pull out a folder this time. He pulled out Harrison's massive official stamped forensic survey report. It landed on the mahogany table with a heavy, definitive thud. "Exhibit B," Saul announced. "A certified forensic land survey conducted by Harrison and Associates, one of the most respected surveying firms in King County. I have highlighted page 4 for your convenience." Chad picked up the report. He started reading. I watched his face. I watched the fake boredom melt away, replaced by a sudden, dawning horror. He flipped a page. He read some more. He swallowed hard. "Mr. Chad," Saul said politely, "would you care to read the highlighted section into the record? Or shall I?" Chad cleared his throat. He looked at Brenda, and for the first time, he looked angry at her. "I'll read it. Based on the recovery of the original 1924 iron monuments, the property line is situated precisely 4.2 feet east of the median trunk line of the removed Western Red Cedar specimens. The entirety of the biological asset in question was located exclusively on the plaintiff's private property." The room went dead silent. You could literally hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. Brenda stared at her lawyer, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. What does that mean?" she stammered. "It means," Saul said, leaning in so close he was almost whispering, "that the trees were not on the property line. They were 4 feet inside my client's yard. You crossed a legal boundary. You ordered the destruction of a massive biological asset on land you do not own, and you did it after being explicitly warned by the property owner." Brenda shook her head frantically. No, that's impossible. The builder said—" "I don't care what a builder allegedly told your husband 20 years ago," Saul cut her off, his voice finally cracking like a whip. "Ignorance of a boundary is not a legal defense against trespass. You did not hire a surveyor before you ordered the cutting. You just assumed, and you assumed wrong." Saul reached into his folder one last time. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Ma'am," Saul said, "are you familiar with the revised Code of Washington, specifically Section 64.12.030? Brenda looked like she was going to be sick. "No. Let me read it to you," Saul said, holding the paper up. He read the timber trespass law. He read the part about "without lawful authority." And then he read the final, devastating sentence. "Any judgment for the plaintiff shall be for treble the amount of damages claimed or assessed." He placed the paper on the table. "We have an arborist report assessing the base replacement value of those trees at $31,666, Saul stated clinically. "Under Washington state law, because your actions were willful, intentional, and without lawful authority, as proven by your own admission on video, that damage is legally mandated to be tripled. That is $95,000, plus my fees, plus the surveyor's fees." Chad finally intervened. "Counsel, we are willing to discuss a reasonable settlement. Obviously, our initial offer of $1,500 was preliminary." "A settlement?" Saul laughed. It was a cold, humorless sound. "Why on earth would we settle for less? You have no defense. You have a client on tape ordering a trespass. We have a forensic survey proving the trespass. We have a certified arborist report proving the damages. If we take this to a judge, my client wins $95,000, and you have to explain to a jury why your client thinks she's above the law." Saul closed his banker's box. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "Here is the only settlement I am offering," Saul said, looking directly at Brenda. "You pay the full $94,998. You cover the $3,000 surveyor fee. You do it within 14 days. If you do that, we drop the lawsuit, and this stays off public court records. If you try to negotiate, if you try to delay, I file the paperwork tomorrow morning, and I will freeze your assets during the litigation process, including your house, including your car." I looked at Brenda. The hubris was gone. The arrogance was entirely vaporized. She wasn't an entitled HOA tyrant anymore. She was just a very frightened woman realizing that her actions finally, truly, had consequences. She looked at Chad, desperately pleading for him to pull some legal trick out of his sleeve to save her. But Chad just looked down at his notes. "We'll need to discuss this outside, counsel." "Take all the time you need," Saul said, checking his watch. "I charge by the hour." Chad practically dragged Brenda out of the conference room. The heavy door clicked shut behind them. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 2 months. I looked at Saul. "Honestly," I whispered, "that was the most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed in my entire life." Saul just gave me a grim, satisfied smile. "Like I said, we don't negotiate. We dictate." We sat in that room for 45 minutes. I passed the time by literally refreshing my phone, feeling this incredible, buzzing energy running through my veins. The legal trap hadn't just worked, it had operated with absolute, flawless precision. Brenda had walked into the jaws of malicious compliance, and Saul had just snapped them shut. When the door finally opened again, Chad walked in first. He looked defeated. Brenda followed behind him. Her eyes were red and puffy. She looked like she had been crying. I felt a brief, fleeting millisecond of pity, but then I remembered the sound of that 2-stroke chainsaw ripping through my century-old privacy screen, and the pity vanished like smoke. They sat back down at the table. "Well?" Saul asked. Chad sighed heavily. "My client's homeowner's insurance has already indicated they will deny a claim for intentional acts of trespass. So, my client will be paying this out of pocket." Chad looked at me, then back at Saul. "We accept your terms," Chad said quietly. "We will have a certified cashier's check for $97,998 delivered to your office by next Friday." I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. I just gave Brenda a slow, polite nod. The sovereign ruling way. "Pleasure doing business with you," Saul said, grabbing his briefcase. We walked out of the office building and stepped into the bright, sunny Bellevue afternoon. I had done it. I had used a hyper-specific Washington logging law to legally force my terrible neighbor to hand over nearly $100,000 for trimming my bushes. It was the ultimate victory. But the story wasn't quite over yet. Because I didn't just win a massive settlement, I still had a ruined property line to fix. And I knew exactly how I was going to do it. Exactly 9 days after the deposition, my phone buzzed with an incoming text from Saul. It was just a picture. A low-resolution, slightly blurry photo of a certified cashier's check resting on his messy mahogany desk. The payee was my name, and the amount was exactly $97,998. Underneath the photo, Saul had just typed, "Come get your money." Honestly, I drove to his office so fast I'm surprised I didn't get pulled over. When I walked in, he just slid the heavy, watermarked piece of paper across the desk. I literally just stood there staring at it for a good 2 minutes. It's one thing to talk about tens of thousands of dollars in a sterile conference room. It's an entirely different reality when you are physically holding a piece of paper worth nearly $100,000 that you extracted from your absolute worst enemy. I took that check straight to my bank. The teller, a very sweet older woman named Barbara, ran it through her machine, looked at the screen, and then looked up at me over her reading glasses. "Well, my goodness," Barbara said, her eyes wide. "Did you sell a house, sweetie? Or win some kind of local lottery?" "Honestly, Barbara," I laughed, leaning against the counter, "I guess you could say I invested in some high-yield timber. Just go ahead and drop that straight into the brokerage account, please." With the money safely secured, earning a very comfortable interest rate, it was time for the final phase of the sovereign ruling master plan. Because getting paid was great, but I still had a massive, gaping 25-foot hole in my backyard that gave me a direct, unobstructed view into Brenda's sterile patio. The silence was nice, but the visual was unacceptable. It was time to build. I didn't go on Craigslist. I didn't ask around on Nextdoor. I spent 3 hours researching the absolute best, most highly rated custom fencing contractors in the greater Seattle area. I wanted a company that usually built security enclosures for tech billionaires in Medina. I found a guy named Mike. Mike owned a high-end contracting company, and when he pulled up to my house for the consultation, he didn't drive a beat-up truck. He drove a pristine, heavy-duty Ford F-350. Mike was a massive guy, built like a retired linebacker, wearing Carhartt gear that actually looked like it had seen real work. I walked him into the backyard and gestured to the mangled cedar stumps and the bright pink string that Harrison, the forensic surveyor, had left running across the grass. "So, Mike," I said, crossing my arms, "here's the situation. I had a 100-year-old cedar hedge right here. The neighbor cut it down. We had a minor legal disagreement about the property line. As you can see by the surveyor's string, the line is actually 4.2 feet further into what she previously thought was her yard." Mike walked over to the pink string. He looked at the massive stumps. He looked at the 4 feet of perfectly manicured grass between the stumps and the string. And then he looked at Brenda's house, where the blinds were very visibly twitching in the front window. A slow, booming chuckle rumbled up from Mike's chest. "Oh, man. You took her to the cleaners, didn't you?" "Like, literally," I nodded, grinning. "So here is what I need. I need a fence. But I don't just want a standard dog-ear picket fence. I want a wall. I want the maximum legal height allowed by Bellevue Municipal Code. I want it solid. I want it built out of premium, clear-grade Western Red Cedar to honor the fallen. And I want the posts set exactly down to the millimeter on that pink line." Mike pulled a tape measure off his belt and stretched it out. "City code dictates a maximum of 6 feet for a solid perimeter fence in a residential backyard. Usually folks leave a few inches of buffer just to be polite." "Mike," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "I want you to be as impolite as the law mathematically allows. I want that fence riding the absolute razor's edge of my legal boundary. I want her to wake up every morning, look out her window, and realize her yard is suddenly 4 feet smaller than it was last month." Mike's grin widened. "I like your style, man. We'll do a premium tongue-and-groove horizontal cedar panel, double-sided so it looks like $1,000,000 on both sides. No gaps, no peeking. Total visual blackout. It won't be cheap, though. Custom cedar like that, plus tearing out these massive old root wads? You're looking at maybe 12, 15 grand. "I have the budget," I assured him. "When can you start? For a job with this much spite attached to it?" Mike laughed. "I'll shuffle my schedule. We'll be here Monday morning." When Monday rolled around, I made sure I was working from my dining room table, right by the window. I had my coffee, my laptop, and a front-row seat to the show. Mike didn't mess around. He showed up with a crew of 6 guys and a piece of heavy machinery called a stump grinder. Now, if you've never heard a commercial stump grinder operate, let me paint you a picture. It sounds like a jet engine trying to digest a bag of loose wrenches. It is deafening. It is violent. It vibrates the earth. And honestly, it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. For 3 solid hours, the crew obliterated the remnants of my poor butchered trees. Wood chips flew everywhere. The noise echoed off Brenda's pristine white siding. I saw her front door open a crack at one point, but the sheer volume and the cloud of flying cedar dust forced her to slam it shut immediately. It was the absolute perfect acoustic revenge for her little two-stroke chainsaw incident. Once the ground was cleared, Mike's team got to work on the boundary. They ran their own high-tension masonry line exactly over Harrison's pink string. They brought out the massive post-hole diggers. And right there, 4.2 feet into what Brenda had spent 20 years believing was her manicured lawn, they started digging deep, wide holes. I walked out to hand the guys some bottled water around noon. Mike was supervising the pouring of the concrete footings. "She come out yet?" I asked casually. "Nope," Mike chuckled, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Saw her glaring through the kitchen blinds, though. When my guy started digging that first hole right in her prized petunias, I thought she was going to break the glass. But she knows better than to step over this string, doesn't she?" "She learned a very expensive lesson about that string," I agreed. The construction took 3 days. It was a masterpiece of speed and precision. They set the massive 4x4 pressure-treated posts, locked them in rapid-set concrete, and then began sliding the custom-milled tongue and groove cedar boards into place. I watched it rise, board by board. It was like watching a beautiful, fragrant, wooden curtain closing on a terrible theatrical performance. By Wednesday afternoon, it was completely finished. Mike invited me out to do the final walkthrough. I stepped off my deck and walked across the grass. The fence was staggering. It wasn't just a boundary, it was architectural art. The horizontal lines were perfectly level. The cedar smelled rich and earthy. It stood exactly 6 feet high, not 5'11", not 6'1", but a legally perfect 72 inches. And the placement was devastating. Because Brenda's patio was relatively close to the original property line, the new fence shifted those crucial 4 feet, now loomed over her outdoor space like a monolith. Her little sun loungers were practically pressed up against the wood. Her morning sun, that she was so desperately trying to protect when she cut down my hedge, completely, totally blocked by the 6-foot shadow of my spite wall. "It's perfect, Mike," I said, running a hand over the smooth wood. "It's literally a work of art." "Built to last 30 years, easy," Mike said proudly, handing me the final invoice. "And it's sealed. Water will bead right off it." I wrote him a check for $14,500 on the spot. I didn't even wince. But I wasn't quite done. A solid wall is great for spite, but I originally moved into this house for the greenery. I missed my trees. The next morning, a local nursery delivery truck pulled up to my driveway. I had ordered 25 premium, fast-growing emerald green arborvitae. They arrived already 6 feet tall, bald and burlapped, ready to go in the ground. I spent my entire Saturday digging the trench. I planted them directly on my side of the new cedar fortress. Emerald greens are incredibly resilient, and they grow thick and dense. Within 2 or 3 years, they would completely cover the wooden fence on my side, restoring the green, living wall I had lost. But unlike the old cedars, these wouldn't drop needles into Brenda's yard. They wouldn't have massive, sprawling branches. They would just exist, perfectly legal, perfectly maintained, in my newly expanded backyard. When the last tree was watered in, I packed up my shovel, washed my hands at the garden hose, and walked up onto my back deck. I went inside, took a quick shower, and threw on a clean t-shirt and my favorite plaid boxers. I poured myself a fresh mug of black coffee and walked back outside. I leaned against the wooden railing of my deck. The late afternoon sun was filtering down through the canopy of the larger neighborhood trees. I looked out over my property. The ugly, jagged stumps were gone. The gap was gone. In their place was a beautiful, unbroken line of vibrant green arbor vitae, backed by an impenetrable fortress of premium cedar. It was quiet. So incredibly quiet. I couldn't see Brenda's white Lexus. I couldn't see her pristine, sterile patio. I couldn't see her judging eyes. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I did some quick mental math in my head. I had received a settlement of $97,998. I paid Saul about $5,000 for his masterful legal warfare. I paid Harrison the surveyor $3,000. I paid Mike the fence guy $14.5, and the new trees were a little over $1,000. That meant, after everything was said and done, I had completely restored my privacy, upgraded my property boundaries, permanently humbled the worst neighbor in King County, and still had a little over $74,000 sitting in my brokerage account, quietly earning dividends. I mean, I guess you could call it a hassle. It took months of stress, police visits, annoying surveyors, and legal maneuvering. It interrupted my work on Olaf's ClickUp board, and it definitely caused some gray hairs. But honestly, looking at that beautiful solid wall and knowing exactly how much it cost Brenda to build it for me, I would do it again in a heartbeat. Always know your property lines, folks. And never, ever mess with a man's trees.